Minister, thanks for joining us today.
Good morning.
The G20 meets at a time of renewed economic uncertainty. We've just seen the IMF move to downgrade the global growth outlook and the Chinese growth outlook. How is the coronavirus impacting France's economic interest today?
I must tell you that we are concerned about the consequences of the coronavirus on the level of growth in France. Our assessment is that the coronavirus might have an impact on the level of growth in China of about 1 point, less growth than expected, and in France it would be 0.1 point less growth than expected. But of course we are monitoring the situation day by day because we do not know exactly where we are, and for the time being we need to be ready and to stand ready to take any further action if needed.
Do you expect this to translate into perhaps a deterioration in French GDP? And are you underestimating the impact here, particularly when you look at the consequences of Chinese tourism into your country? This is a $4 billion industry, and indeed France being the #1 destination for Chinese tourists around the world.
For the time being, once again, we have a limited impact. That's our current assessment. But we are really monitoring day by day the situation, and I hope that there won't be any deterioration in the coronavirus situation. You have an impact, of course, on the number of Chinese tourists in France. You have more than 2.7 million Chinese tourists each year in France. It won't be the same, of course, in 2020. And you also have a very important consequence on the chain of values, because, of course, you have many goods that are produced in China and that are needed by French industry and by French companies. So there is difficulties on the chain of values for the French industry.
So perhaps a significant supply chain disruption. But just on the issue of tourism, have you seen those tourism numbers drop off quite significantly?
We have less tourists, of course, in France, about 30%, 40% less than expected. That's, of course, an important impact for the French economy. But once again, the key factor and the key point for us is the supply chain for the French industry.
I know you've also met with Madame Lagarde this weekend. Do you think that this could perhaps result in a rate cut from the ECB or perhaps more QE?
No, I think, and Christine Lagarde made very clear, that we have a current monetary policy which is for us the right one, but there is not so much margin of maneuver for the monetary policy and for the ECB. But the point which is really very clear is that there is a lack of growth within Europe, and a lack of growth, especially within the Eurozone, among the 19 members of the Eurozone. And there is clearly the necessity to better use the fiscal space to boost growth within the Eurozone. And I've been advocating for many months to better use the fiscal space so that we can really reinforce the impact of the monetary policy on the level of growth. Monetary policy alone is not enough anymore. We need to have the fiscal policy taking the lead and playing its role to boost the growth within the Eurozone.
So are you saying here that you're quite concerned that the ECB is essentially running out of policy ammunition here when it comes to mitigating some of the impacts, not just of the coronavirus, but broader concerns around the Eurozone as well?
No, I would not say that, but we have to recognize that the ECB is doing the job, to be very blunt. It is doing the job. We have a very accommodative monetary policy, but now there is clearly a need to use the fiscal policy. You know, when you are looking at the level of growth, the average level of growth within the Eurozone, I will be very simple. That's not enough. That's disappointing. Around 1%, 1.1%, we should do better. We should invest more. We should fund innovation. And we should use the fiscal space so that the monetary policy would be far more efficient for the prosperity of European people. You know, we have to look at what is our political purpose. Our political purpose is to have more prosperity for the European citizen, and for that we need to use the fiscal policy.
When it comes to fiscal policy, it's quite an interesting time as well, because it does look like negotiations over the EU budget have stalled. Brexit has left an $80 billion hole in the budget. What happens next, and do you have a date for the next meeting to resolve some of these issues?
There has been a first meeting. It has not been conclusive, so there will be another meeting, I think, in a few weeks. But we just have to ask the question, what do we want for Europe? Do we want Europe to play its part on the international stage between China and the United States? Do we want Europe to be able to fund new technologies, innovation, artificial intelligence, and the key technologies that would make the difference between the sovereign states and the other in the 21st century? That's the question behind the question of the budget, the European budget. And we are, with Emmanuel Macron, asking for more European expenses for the sake of having a sovereign Europe. The key political question behind the question of the European budget is the question of the sovereignty of Europe. We are willing to get a sovereign Europe playing its part between China and the US.
Can you afford it, though? That's the question.
Yes, of course. You know, we have the single market with 450 million people, which are the richest in the world. That's the richest single market within the world. We just have to be tough. We just have to put some willingness on the table and ask for more innovation, more investment in new technologies and in this question of sovereignty.
As the budget is being resolved, we also have trade negotiations between the EU and the UK taking place in the coming days. What do you expect to happen on this front, and what will be the conditions for a deal to be reached on EU-UK trade from France's perspective? What are you looking out for?
First of all, I hope, of course, that there will be a deal and that there will be an agreement between the UK and the EU. It would be better for all of us. But I want to be very clear. Rules are rules. If the UK wants to get access to the single market, to the 450 million consumers of the EU, they need to abide by the European rules. And there won't be any deterioration and any weakening of the European rules for the sake of having a deal with the UK.
So what's your message to Boris Johnson as these talks get underway?
I don't have a message to give to Boris Johnson. I just have a message to give to the British people. We strongly regret the decision that has been taken by the UK to leave the EU, but that's a sovereign decision. But they have to understand that there are rules within the European market, and of course, our role is to defend our economic interest and to defend our rules.
Is the timeline too ambitious on these talks? Will he be able to get a deal done?
I think that we have to go quickly. Time is of the essence. If we want to get a deal, we can reach a deal very quickly. Having too long negotiations is not the best way to move on.
I also wanted to ask you about another issue that you've been speaking about here. You said that digital taxation is a key political issue for the 21st century. Obviously, there is some differences of opinion on this issue when you look at the European perspective and when you look at the American perspective. Do you think that perhaps the Americans have been dragging their feet on this issue?
No, I think we are working very good with Stephen Mnuchin on that issue, because we all recognize, either the US or the EU, that there is a loophole in the international taxation system. When you are looking at a new economic model, you have very important private companies making profits without any physical presence. That's the case for digital giants, either American, European, or Chinese. They are making huge profits in countries without any physical presence. So they are not paying their due taxes. And how can you explain to the people that small SMEs will pay their due taxes when the biggest companies of the world will not pay the same level of taxes, 40 points less taxation than the SMEs? So we have to address this issue for a reason of fairness and efficiency. I think that since there is a consensus on the necessity to move on, now we have to tackle the technical issues, but I hope that we will be able to get a compromise by the end of 2020 on this question of digital taxation and minimum taxation. And I just want to make clear that this is also in the interest of the American digital companies. What do they want? Do they prefer to have many national solutions everywhere in Europe? You have digital taxation in France, in Italy, in Spain, in Austria, in the Czech Republic. Or do they prefer to have one single taxation model? And I think, as Mark Zuckerberg said, for instance, that it's far better for all of us to have one single solution.
What about the optics of this, though? Is it odd, perhaps, that the European Union, which has no tech industry of note, is leading the charge against regulating some of the biggest technology firms in the world, which are mostly coming out of the United States? Because those companies say that these new taxes and new regulations could perhaps stifle innovation and stifle competition. Is that fair?
I understand that point, but there is no discrimination against any state, and certainly not against our American friends and American companies. You know, you have European companies in the scope of digital taxation. You have Chinese companies in the scope of digital taxation. What we want to address is the question of this new economic model based on digital activities without any physical presence. And we hope that in the very next future there will be digital European giants and that they will be under the scope of this digital taxation.
How does new taxes and new regulation create new European digital giants?
I hope that in the very near future, thanks to the IA, thanks to new technologies, we will be able to build new European digital giants. They won't be the same, of course, as the ones that have been successful in the US. And that's very good news for the US, very good news for the world to have those companies being successful. But we also want, within Europe, to build our own digital giants in very specific areas. And I think that we have all the skills, all the technologies to be successful.
Minister, thanks for your time.
Thank you.